welcome to another Mobycon Academy webinar. Today we're going to be talking about simplifying safety, or how we can solve the traffic safety crisis in the US and the Netherlands a little bit as well. Because the news is bad, traffic violence is bad, and it's getting worse, especially in the US. While most countries see a slow decline of the number of traffic fatalities, or flatlining a little bit like in the Netherlands, the US actually recorded a record-breaking number of fatalities last year, up about 10% from the year before. So that is a real problem, and it's getting worse. And what do we need to do about it? That's what we're going to be discussing today in our webinar. And for that, I am joined by my colleague Eveline de Jong from our Dutch office and our colleague Zach Vanderkooy from our Colorado office. Welcome, Zach, to your first webinar, I believe. So the traffic safety crisis, it is a real and a serious issue. It's not just an issue for the population as a whole, but particularly for pedestrians and cyclists, and in most particular way for children. Traffic fatalities are now the second biggest cause of death for children in the US, and that is basically after gun violence, which is obviously a horrific statistic. And that's because we have a lot more cars than we had 20 years ago. The number of cars in the US since the year 2000 has increased by 25%, so that's already a huge increase. And if you look at 1990, for example, which is not that long ago, it's about a 42% increase in the number of vehicles on our roads. So it's a very slow but steady increase, and that's just becoming to a sort of a tipping point for traffic safety, as it appears to be. At the same time, there is an obsession with bigger and heavier cars, which has a really detrimental effect on pedestrian safety. It's proven that SUVs are much more dangerous for everybody outside the vehicle, but more safe for people inside the vehicle. And that leads to a sort of a vicious circle of people feeling unsafe and thus wanting to buy a bigger and heavier vehicle. So dare save themselves, but with all the negative consequences for everybody outside their own car. But it's not all bad news, because the political wind does seem to be changing a little bit. There's more focus on traffic safety, also from a federal level, as we will hear from Zach in a minute. And a lot of cities have proclaimed Vision Zero to be their goal, which is a big term, and we're going to be deciphering that a little bit in this webinar. What does that mean, and what can we learn from a similar crisis situation that we had in the Netherlands in the 70s? So to start with, we're going to go to cross over to Zach in our Colorado office, and he's going to tell us why we should be concerned, but also optimistic about traffic safety in the US.
Thank you, Lennart. Yes, like you said, it is a bad situation here. I think the US ranks 47th out of 51 developed wealthy democracies in terms of traffic safety rates. But it isn't without hope. My goal today is to bring some context to that situation, but also draw attention to some of the positive, I think, promising trends and opportunities that we're seeing on this side of the Atlantic. But also important to maintain a healthy skepticism. So I'm going to give you 5 reasons to be optimistic, and also 5 reasons maybe to not stop paying attention yet. With a problem like traffic safety, it's so big, it's so severe, it's very easy to get overwhelmed and cynical about it. But I don't think that's very helpful. So what we need to do is stay engaged and keep paying attention to this problem, and create accountability for ourselves and our leaders and how we can solve it. So the first reason why I think we can be a little bit optimistic in the US is that for the first time in our history, we have solid commitments from the very highest levels of national leadership around safety. This is our Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg. A core principle, a fundamental element of any Vision Zero or safety plan is vocal leadership. And it's very, very important to have those public commitments from your highest levels of leaders. A plan will go nowhere without your most visible leaders actively supporting it. And believe it or not, this is the first time in the history of the United States that our highest level, cabinet level transportation leader has said 0 deaths. That is the target, that is the goal. No one needs to die in traffic. So this is significant, this is important. A reason maybe to maintain a little bit of skepticism, though, is that it's very easy to make one-time proclamations. So the real test of success of this will be, how does this present itself in terms of long-term policy? How does this sustain changes in politics and in leadership? The second reason why we can be optimistic about traffic safety in the US is that the proclamation from our Secretary of Transportation comes with a very thorough and I think pretty good national safety strategy. Again, something we really haven't had before, surprisingly. It's a substantial, thoughtful strategy. It's called the National Safety Strategy, I believe. And it incorporates a lot of the best practices from international wisdom around traffic safety, like the Dutch system. So it's very proactive and data-driven. It's systemic. It looks at the entire ecosystem of traffic safety, not just focusing on one particular facet like behavior change or law enforcement. It's multidisciplinary. It asks lots of different types of professionals to be involved and take responsibility for this. And I think most importantly, it emphasizes safe roads and safe speeds. So if we're serious about traffic safety, we have to change the way streets work, and that focuses on managing speed and changing the physical world. It recognizes that humans are fallible. We are going to make mistakes. The goal is not zero crashes. That's not a realistic or even possible to achieve goal. But the goal is zero deaths, zero serious injuries. So how do we focus on that? So I'm pretty positive on this national safety strategy. Are we focused on the right things? In this circle, I think that, if I were making it, I probably would make it more of a pyramid with safe speeds and safe roads at the top, because I think changing the way streets work is the most important strategy. But if we move on to why this is different, this is not this is not business as usual. So on the next slide there, this is about changing generations of thinking on traffic safety and engineering, and it recognizes that we need to shift away from asking people to simply drive better and behave better, to changing the way that the entire system works, from design to enforcement to policy. The third reason why we can be optimistic is that we are starting to slow down. Speed is everything when it comes to preventing deaths, particularly for people who are outside of cars, people on bikes, people walking. And cities, much like with the rise of the protected bike lane in the past decade, cities are leading the way. Several major cities across the country have adopted default speed limits on residential roads of 20 miles per hour. And that's significant. It's a policy change. It says every street, unless marked otherwise, is a 20 mile per hour speed limit. That's important because it's important to set that precedent. It normalizes the type of safe behavior that we want to see. And probably most importantly, it gives professionals, practitioners in traffic engineering and planning a mandate. Say that this is the target speed. We're going to design all of our roads to match this speed function. And this is not just a city problem. It's actually a rural problem. It's a small town problem. It affects every type, size, and type of community across the country. And so this is a promising trend that we're seeing. We hope to see a lot more of it. A reason to maintain a healthy, productive skepticism about this is that changing the speed limits doesn't actually result in any behavior change. We've seen that repeated in a number of studies. It has to be accompanied by physical changes to the way streets work. But this is an important first step. This is why the state of the practice has more or less coalesced around 20 miles per hour as the ideal compromise between mobility and safety. The reason is that pedestrians, people outside of cars, the most vulnerable people are much less likely to die when they're hit by a car at 20 miles per hour than they are at faster speeds. So there's a reason why that has become the speed that we're focused on. Reason number 4 for optimism is that there is some significant funding behind this national proclamation. Is that it's not just a commitment, it's a commitment with actual dollars to make it happen. So the Safe Streets and Roads for All grant program is part of the recently passed Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the bipartisan infrastructure law. And what it does is bring $1 billion a year for 5 years, so $5 billion total over 5 years, to local governments to implement safety programs. So we're really excited about this program. It's a significant amount of money. It's eligible entities are cities, counties, MPOs, tribal governments, even transit agencies. So it's a direct federal to local grant program, which is pretty unique for the United States. So we are really excited to work with communities in the United States over the next 5 years, helping to implement some of their safety strategies. And we're excited that the federal government is leading on this. And finally, I think a reason we can be optimistic is that this isn't a problem without solutions. It's not rocket science. It's actually just traffic engineering. In fact, we know what the solutions are. We can see them, and I think the Netherlands has a really viable and important model for solutions to this problem. It's not a problem of technical knowledge, it's a problem of political and popular will. So with that, I want to send it over to Eveline to tell us a little bit more about the Dutch experience with safety and what kind of lessons in transferability there is for the rest of the world.
Okay, thank you, Zach. So for the story of the Netherlands, we start in the years after the Second World War. This was a time of economic growth, but also a time of rebuilding the cities. A lot of the cities in the Netherlands were demolished by the occupation, by the war. And so there was a large need for new housing. And that new housing also came with a lot of roads, also for cars. So in the years after the World War, a lot of focus was on getting traffic through the cities and to separate modes from each other to have like an effective and functional city. And that meant that there was also more room for the car, and more room for the car led to more cars, obviously. So the city was being built for the car, and with more cars on the road, the number of injuries and deaths also began to rise. So in the 50s, you can see that the number of cars was growing at a much lower pace than in the 60s, but the number of deaths went higher and higher the further along we went. And that's that same trend we can see in the different years towards the 70s. But in the 70s, there was a turning point, or at least there were separate turning points, multiple turning points. So the first one was that there was an oil crisis. So like what we have today a bit, is that the oil was very expensive. So to preserve as much oil as possible, there were car-free Sundays in the Netherlands. That meant that all highways were closed, cars weren't allowed to drive, and there was more room for playing outside, also on the highways, as you can see in this picture. But with more cars and more deaths, there was also more outrage. So there was public outrage by the number of deaths. It was the focus in the paper articles were always on the people that died instead of the people that caused the crash. So there was a lot of attention to children playing and that sort of thing, like it was a bad thing. And the public was outraged that they didn't do anything to stop these deaths, which was possible, they thought. So this was a turning point in the Dutch approach to safety. As you can see here, the turning point in the 70s, so the outrage really led to a decline in the number of deaths that went through at least till about now. At least, to about now. But it wasn't as if the outrage in the 70s was the only thing that took place. It was actually a policy that was done in waves. So in the 50s, with the rise of the number of cars, there was also, already some legislation available to point out where the car was supposed to go, how it was supposed to react to certain to cyclists and pedestrians who had priority and that sort of thing. But that wasn't enough to stop the number of fatalities going up. So the second wave in policy was the wave of safe motor highways, because that was where the speed was high and it was a different experience on the highways. So the focus was especially on the highways. This was in the 60s. And with the public outrage in the 70s, the focus changed more on inside the urban area. Before that, it was mostly about outside of the urban area, and most of the deaths in the 70s were on inside the urban area. So where people live, where people shop, that sort of thing. And instead of the focus being on getting as much traffic through the city, the focus was more on making it a livable city, a city that you can share and you can meet people, and that you can actually live in instead of being afraid to step outside of your door. And in the 80s, so we have the outrage in the 70s and the numbers are going down, but we still need work. We still need to work on safety. So in the 80s, there was more focus on the improvement of behavior, especially on the motor behavior. So behavior of wearing your seatbelt was also important, more on actions towards people to wear seatbelts and not drink alcohol and that sort of thing. That was the 80s, and a shift more to local government in the 90s. And with all these campaigns, the number of deaths went down, but the number of cars still increased more. So the decline wasn't as steep as the number of cars went up, which meant that the risk of a fatality was starting to bottom out, or at least to slow down. And with this risk of fatalities slowing down, and with the uncertainty if it was going to go up, sustainable safety was introduced in the 90s. And sustainable safety was a vision that was established in 1993, and it was implemented in 1997. And the focus was more on the street with 30 kilometers per hour, and also the streets of 50 kilometers per hour, what you have to do to get the behavior that you want. So how should the street look like to get the behavior that you want? And the aim was to reduce the chance of mistakes, so collisions, and reduce the intensity or severity of the crash. So both of those things. So if something does happen, that the severity is lower. There were 3 original principles on sustainable safety. So you had functionality. So you have a road network which has a certain hierarchy. You have roads that are more for throughput and roads that are more for living and where traffic is a secondary function. You have homogeneity. Homogeneity.
Good word.
Yeah, good word. So that means that if modes are driving not the same speed, do not have the same mass, and do not travel in the same direction, they should be separated at higher speeds, and you can only mix them if they are at lower speeds, because then the problem is less severe. And the third one was recognizability. And that meant that you had to recognize, you had to have certain characteristics on each road, so you can recognize what speed you are supposed to drive, who you should give priority, so you can have more time to focus on the people surrounding you, and less time to focus on what you have to do, because you know that by the design of the street. Sustainable safety is still a work in progress. So in 2005, 2 principles were added. So you have the principle of forgiveness. So if you make a tiny mistake, that you are able to fix it without very large consequences. And the second one is status awareness, which is a bit more vague, but meant that if there's someone driving on the road which has who drank alcohol or something like that, that it's also not very dangerous for yourself as well. And then I think a couple of years ago, they restructured the principles, but they remain mostly the same. Yeah, so this is sustainable safety as it is now.
Super interesting to see that it wasn't a whole comprehensive move, right? Like the US is trying at the moment. They put all of those 5 waves basically into one, which makes it probably effective, because you're doing everything that we did over 50 years. You put it in one package and then roll it out all at the same time, which seems like a smart idea. But Zach, do you have any idea if that might be too much? Is the US trying to do everything and it should take more time?
I think that's a really important lesson from the Dutch experience with this, is that it was a generation-long project, and that there were different emphases throughout the different eras, I guess you could say, of sustainable safety. We don't have that kind of time. The crisis is now, and I don't believe that we have the luxury of incrementalism. So I think it is appropriate and relevant that we are really trying to do a lot of these things all at once. But I do think that the emphasis right now in our work, our practice, needs to be on speed management and road design, because that's where we're going to have the greatest impact on bringing down the deaths and severe injuries in traffic.
Yeah, and that seems to be in line with the original principles from sustainable safety, right? As functionality, homogeneity, and recognizability. That's all relating to street design, right? Are those still the most important principles here that you use in your daily practice?
Yeah, so the principle of functionality is more or less already incorporated in most of the network, and unless you're building a new city or a real add-on to your city. I think now recognizability is most important, and where we are still lacking somewhat in the Netherlands.
Yeah, because the network is not perfect. There's still streets that are not not designed properly.
Yeah.
And I guess we have some new street typologies,
Yep.
the bicycle streets and the bicycle boulevards, where we still are not entirely sure which way it should go, right?
Yep.
If it's a little bit more, how that fits in the system of sustainable safety.
Yep.
I guess that's
Yeah, in some cases there already is a perfect network, at least on paper, but it's not there in practice.
Right.
So they decided where the throughput roads were, but they can't physically make it as they wanted.
Yeah, I think that's a valuable lesson, right? We're 50 years into this, from the crisis point, 50 years in, and we still haven't fixed everything. And I think that's going to be a similar type of development in the US, where you start at one point, but it just takes a whole refurb of your entire street network before you finished it, even though you're never going to finish it.
But I think that we can see these principles in practice every day here on our side of the Atlantic. The most dangerous road types by rate of safety are arterials, usually in suburban and urban areas, where there are mixtures of design elements, from limited access highways to local roads, all kind of trying to do everything on a road. And this is the type of road that Strong Towns Charles Marone calls a strode. And it's very common in suburban and urban areas in America, where it's being asked to move a very large amount of car traffic at very high speeds, but also accommodate different users, different pedestrians, bikes, commerce, lots of different land uses. This is what we mean by homogeneity and recognizability. These roads are not homogeneous, and they're not very recognizable. They're confusing to use, and that's why they tend to have some of the greatest risks associated with them. So one of the first things we can take from this experience is, one, stop building stroads, and let's work to prioritize those in our safety plans on roads we can improve in the near term.
And that could mean optimizing streets for flow, right? Because we here at Mobycon, we often talk about making streets more cycle-friendly and more pedestrian-friendly, but maybe sometimes it is better to just go all in and say, no, this is actually a road, not a street, and we should design it safely for cars and separate the pedestrians and the bikes, give them an alternative option. And I think that's something that, maybe people don't expect, and they don't expect it to see that kind of treatment here in the Netherlands, where we have quite a lot of limited access arterials, where you have the center lanes, which are not accessible to bikes, and they have their own separate network. So that may be an interesting transfer of experience from the Netherlands. That optimizing for car traffic can be a good and valid option to improve traffic safety. Yeah. So we have a couple of topics to discuss in terms of what the US can learn from the Netherlands, and maybe vice versa as well. We're not sure yet. And the first one is about communication, because we see, the Dutch called it sustainable safety. The Swedes started with Vision Zero, which kind of evokes a more emotional response often in people, because they either agree with it because they say, yes, it's unethical to have anybody die on our roads, but Other people disagree because they say, well, you're never going to get to zero. So how important is that communication, and how has that been, what's the experience been in the US?
It's very important. How we talk about this really matters, and that's important for bringing stakeholders and the public along with the vision. We hear the terms Vision Zero used a lot. We hear the term sustainable safety used a lot, and we also hear a newer term, safe systems approach, used a lot. Those three things are not exactly the same, but they share a lot in common. Sustainable safety is just the literal translation of the Dutch program. Vision Zero, of course, comes from Sweden, and that's powerful and simple to understand. There's a peril, though, of saying we're all in on Vision Zero, but we're not going to achieve zero. Not even, no country has achieved zero. So there's a pitfall on communicating around that it's not something that you're going to achieve very quickly, but it is still important to have that vision. The safe systems approach is really, I like it. It's a set of practices and principles and a recipe for how to get to Vision Zero. And that's what our national highway safety strategy focuses on, is a safe systems approach. But a point about language that's really important for us as practitioners, communicating with the public and our leaders. Early on in the safety movement in the United States, one of the great successes was implementing a change in how we talk about traffic crashes. So using the term crash instead of accident. And implying that accidents are something that is just not preventable. That's something that just sort of happens. No one can do anything about it. There was a concerted campaign by advocates in the US led by a number of different very effective nonprofits to get media, to get journalists to stop using the term crash. And that's been pretty successful. So I think we need to keep going along that track of thinking deeply about language. How do we talk about this? Do we talk about vulnerable road users, or do we talk about dangerous road users? How does that cast different actors in the system of traffic as victims or perpetrators? I kind of tend to prefer to use the term dangerous road users when referring to the cars and trucks, because they're by far the greatest source of danger. But communication matters. I'm curious if there's been any experience like that in the Dutch story about how we talk about this to the public, and how has that changed perceptions?
Yeah, Eveline, is there any Vision Zero in the Netherlands at the moment?
Not literally. They are focusing on getting less deaths in traffic and less severe accidents, but they don't call it Vision Zero. So it's not really clear if they are going towards zero, but they are. They have numbers.
But the national policy is not zero.
No,
so that's where we're actually a little bit behind the US at the moment, which is quite interesting, right?
Yeah.
And is there a lot of attention on traffic safety at the moment in the Netherlands, you would say?
Yes, there's a lot of attention on the proactive method of trying to prevent accidents instead of fixing an intersection where a lot of accidents already happened. So especially the large cities are really moving forward and really paying a lot of attention to it, and provinces already have campaigns to support local governments to implement these safer.
Given that the Netherlands has been going with sustainable safety for so long already, what is the focus on for the government, the different levels of government? Is it still on what do the streets look like and how do we prevent those crashes from happening, or is it back to behavior or legal, or what's the biggest effort in your opinion?
The biggest effort is still towards design of streets, and especially the 50 kilometer per hour streets, because that's where a lot of the crashes still happen, because some of them are still not equipped with separated facilities. So the focus is now more on either slowing those streets down, or the cars on those streets, or making more room for separate facilities or separate networks.
Right, so it's not dissimilar from the US situation where you have the stroads, which may be a little bit more extreme versions of our normal 50 kilometer per hour streets, but still subpar facilities, still working on better facilities for pedestrians and cyclists, and trying to slow down the cars where you can't fit it, right? So,
I think the only difference is the number of 50 kilometers per hour streets, which are not equipped for everything.
Yeah.
Compared to how many there are that are already good.
So it's a little bit more focused on the few problem streets, trying to get those in. So you got a long road ahead of you, Zach. Is a 5-year program with 1 billion a year. That sounds like a lot, but it's going to require probably a lot more. Have you got any sense of what's next after this, or is it really just focused on delivering as much as they can in this stage?
Well, right. It's going to take a lot more than $5 billion. But I think that the emphasis is now in the right place. Working on managing speeds and the design of roads. I think I want to draw some parallels between where the Netherlands was in the 1970s and now. The oil crisis in the 70s was a big motivator for policy around safety then. I think we're right at the front of, if not currently in, a contemporary oil crisis now. And then the question is, how do we respond to that? Can we respond in a way that makes changes to the way streets work rather than simply making small incremental fuel efficiency improvements in our fleets? I think there's a role for emotion in this too. The Stop the Kindermord, Stop the Child Murder campaign in the 1970s was very powerful, because it speaks directly to people not trying to use necessarily logical, rational arguments. We have a logical, rational argument, and we tend to make that over and over again. But I think there is a place for that kind of outrage that's needed for us to make significant changes here, because it has to be depoliticized. We have to create changes that sustain, administration changes at the national level and at the local level, and that's a big challenge for us right now. But I think that we've seen a way that it can work in one country, and our way might be different. But we're at a point where we can either go forward quickly and make a lot of improvements or not.
And do you see, well, first of all, do you need the outrage? And then second question, do you see that outrage already, or is it still bubbling away a little bit?
That's a good question. Do you need the grassroots side as it happened in 50 years ago in the Netherlands? I don't know. I think probably not. I think there are different ways to do this. The lack of public outrage around deaths in traffic is kind of puzzling to me. It has been for my whole career. Why there isn't more of it. But I think at the same time, there's just a lot of fatigue. There's a lot of things to be outraged about, a lot of things to be stressed about, and so it's hard to compete in some ways. And I think that there's a big danger in accepting high levels of traffic deaths as just the cost of doing business. That this is just the price we have to pay for all of the mobility that we have. And I think that's certainly not true. We can have high levels of mobility and have much safer roads.
Yeah, totally. There was recently a really powerful article in the New Yorker magazine about the really grassroots outrage in specific spots, right? And that does seem to be slowly working its way through the system to like state level, and maybe some of it reached federal level now, and at least some money is being allocated to do something about it. So maybe the cogs are in motion, and you can do it with a slightly lower level of outrage instead of needing national protests and waiting for that tipping point to happen. Hopefully, that will be good. There's also an interesting comparison with the Netherlands at the moment, where we do have a stop in the reduction of traffic fatalities, right? So it's bottoming out. A lot of people are blaming the rise of cell phones, people being distracted while they're driving, but also more cyclists on our roads, which are, even though they're not the aggressor, they are more likely to get into a crash because they're not in a steel cage. But is there outrage in the Netherlands at the moment about it, you would say?
No, I don't think so.
Also a little bit of complacency.
Yeah, well, you can see, I think once a year they publish the new results, and people will say, oh, this is crazy or something like that, but not real public outrage, no.
But in the professional world?
In the professional world, there is a lot of concern.
And that's, I think, an interesting topic. Is there real concern in the professional world in the US, Zach? Can you taste the outrage among professional traffic engineers?
I can. Having been part of this for a while, I can taste the outrage in the practitioner world. And one asset that we have here is some very active and effective different organizations, NGOs and government organizations that are working on this problem. The Vision Zero Network is a network of cities. The National Road to Zero Coalition is another group of professionals and agencies that are working toward this. So we have good, I guess you could call it a soft infrastructure in place that of organizations that are working on this problem. So I think that the ingredients are there for some pretty significant systemic change, and it's the political will and the popular will that's the biggest obstacle. But I think we're seeing it. I think we are shifting.
That's very empowering. That's good. That's really good news, and I think that will make the spending of the 1 billion a year, right? Because allocating money is one, but actually spending it on the right type of projects. For that, you need that professional body of engineers and planners to be on board with this. And even though there might not be enough money for every city, there might be enough money for at least the active cities where those networks and those professionals work to make changes in their own environments. So what's still needed in the US? What is still required to really make this systemic shift last, to make it part of general normal practice, and to give the planners and engineers the tools to keep doing this even beyond the next 5 years?
So the first thing that every community needs is a good plan, a good safety plan, and that's kind of what Eveline was talking about by the 3 original principles of the sustainable safety. You need to have a network plan that describes the functionality of every road that's very clear and simple and easy to understand, so that you can achieve those homogeneity and recognizability principles in your street network. You have to know what every street is for before you can make a good design for it, and that has to come from a planning level. So that's why 40% of those federal SS4A grants are dedicated to planning, to creating plans for communities that do not yet have them. So that's step 1. And then step 2 is actually making the changes. So this comes down to methodically, systematically changing every street. And that's taking advantage of every opportunity for resurfacing, for restriping, to improve streets. It's also, in some cases, making maybe even temporary or quick build kind of pilot projects to try out different solutions, because the solution for every street may be different. So it's really just those 2 steps back to back. That's kind of what we need, and we need it to be systemic in the sense that it's just part of doing business. It doesn't matter who the mayor is. It doesn't matter who the transportation director is. It doesn't matter who the president is. It's just part of what we do every day in the practice.
And how is that in the Netherlands, Eveline? If you want to make changes as a city, is it a very political process, in your opinion?
Partly. Yes. Mostly when traffic safety comes at the cost of getting less cars through your street, or getting rid of parked cars, then it turns a bit political, because then you're trying to tease the car owners away from your cities. And yeah.
But a general street redesign in line with the principles of sustainable safety, does it always have to go to council, for example?
No, not necessarily. No, it really depends on
how
the type.
Much you change the structure of the city. Right. So once you've got the right standards and the right empowerment of the planners and the engineers, they can just go ahead and do it without getting too much interference with changing governments in the city.
Yeah, if you really want to change the road from 50 to 30, then it's a whole process.
Yeah.
Of course.
Yeah, of course. Then that's actually changing the structure. Right. So it does sound like a lot of those ingredients are there. It would be good to get that systemic change normalized, right? Like you said, Zach, make that just the way we do things now, and remove some of that political back and forth from the process. So maybe that'll be an interesting next step in the communities in the US. Do you think it's the larger cities that are going to be leading the way on this with the SS4A grants as well, or do you think there's more opportunities for smaller cities to push the boundaries a bit more?
I think there's opportunities for all types of cities and communities, urban, rural, suburban, every type. I think for these particular grants, there's a lot of cities are working on this already. Many big cities have Vision Zero programs established, and they're doing the hard work every day. I think for this particular federal grant program, there's a lot of opportunity for smaller communities, particularly in less populated states, to access some significant resources to advance their safety goals.
Yeah. And how are we as Mobycon? How can we help them?
Well, we would love to work with communities who are interested, whether they're just starting and needing to create a good network plan for their transportation networks around safety, or if they have a plan and they're doing the hard, detailed work of designing their streets. Those are things we love to do.
Awesome. So cities, get your A into G and get those programs and projects in because there is free money to be had. And to make a real dent in your traffic safety plan, now is the time, because otherwise the crisis is not going to solve itself, I think. And we're going to do a whole next webinar on what it means to actually invest in that kind of money in street design and what you should be aiming for in terms of those 3 principles of sustainable safety, what it looks like on the ground, and what we can learn from the US from the Netherlands in the North American context. But that was too much to fit into this webinar, so we're gonna have a whole separate webinar to talk about that. For now, I would really like to thank Eveline for your insights from the Netherlands. Super interesting to see mostly that the development of the Dutch safety paradigm was really in waves, and super encouraging to see most of those elements back into the national safety plan. Zach, thank you so much for your insights from the US context. And I'm super excited to see what's going to happen in the next 5 years, because maybe we can finally turn the ship around and turn the rising number of fatalities into a number that gets lower and lower every year, and make the world a little bit safer. So with that, thank you very much for watching, and like and subscribe, and see you at the next Mobycon Academy webinar. Thank you.